thank you so much for taking the time out to join us today. So this is an event put on by WeGoHighNC North Carolina NORML. North Carolina NORML, our goal is to work with the state legislators in order to improve cannabis policy in all 50 states, but specifically here in North Carolina. And so as an organization, we try to hold these conversations, try to invite both candidates or any candidate from any party, because we're a nonpartisan organization, to just discuss cannabis. Truth is, though, it is a tough topic for some people. There's still a lot of stigma surrounding, so some individuals maybe don't always feel as comfortable talking about it. So thank you so much for taking the time, and I guess we'll kick off. So the first question I had was just if you could tell me a little bit more about your background, because I know that you come from like a slightly alternative background than someone who maybe is currently in the DAC, but I'm curious about your background and what made you decide to run for district attorney for Wake County.
Sure, if we go way back, I am very atypical for a Democrat. I'm running as a Democrat, is that I was actually a conservative, a Republican back in early 2000s. And I've moved to the left, though I think there's commonality across the spectrum. In the last 13 years, I've been a criminal defense attorney in Raleigh, where I focused originally on lower end cases, by which I mean serious to the person who's facing them: DWIs, driving while impaired, drunk, what we typically think of as drunk driving, misdemeanor marijuana cases, misdemeanor assault cases. In the last 5 or 6 years, I've focused on more serious crimes. So now I do mostly murders, federal drug trafficking, all the panoply of federal cases, and higher level cases. So that's what I focus on now. And I practice mainly in Wake County, which is in our state courts, and in eastern North Carolina. And then also I practice in the federal courts of the Eastern District.
Well, I guess in terms of your interest in running for district attorney, what kind of kicked that off?
So 2 years ago, I was volunteering for the Bernie Sanders campaign, and that was unfortunately unsuccessful. And this is as a former registered Republican, but I was volunteering for him, and I saw that there was a lot of. One of the things that he did do was that he inspired people who cared about ideas to come out and work for a campaign. So I've said there's 2 ways to win this campaign. The first way is to win it by actually winning the race, which is what I intend to do. But the second way is by getting conversations started about issues like this. And so it was about 2 years ago that I decided to run.
So, and I guess in terms of your perspective, what's the most important change that a district attorney can create within their district? What power can this position hold to fix the system?
So let me describe a little bit what I think many of you might know, but for those watching, I'll just say what a district attorney is. A district attorney is the chief law enforcement officer of the county or of the judicial district. But in Wake County, we have a single county and a single prosecutor for that county. The Wake County District Attorney is responsible for enforcing or prosecuting those crimes that are charged by city, county, and local police, and for enforcing those laws. And so the district attorney is an incredibly powerful role, no matter whether that's in Wake County or in Johnston County or in any other part of the country. In the United States, the district attorney has fairly broad discretion to decide what kinds of cases are going to be prosecuted, what the overall policy of the office is going to be, what the punishments that are going to be exacted tend to be exacted. And so we can achieve a lot of change by having someone in there, depending on what your philosophy is. But depending on what your philosophy is, we can have a lot of change and effect. So I've focused on a couple of issues.
Yeah, that's awesome. So what made you want to pick up the issue of cannabis policy?
It's something that I've watched the drug war over the last 12 years, and the drug war has, as a defense attorney, I see it as it affects individual human beings, and this is a range of folks from misdemeanor marijuana cases for whom the charge and the conviction could be devastating to them. It could exclude them from a home, It could throw them out of public housing. It could cause their eviction, lose a job, all the way up to large amounts of drugs. And I've seen the failure, broadly speaking, of how we've addressed drugs in the United States. But that is in particular most egregious when it comes to marijuana. And for reasons that your organization, I think, understands. And I think increasingly people understand out in the world that the prosecution of folks who have adult use quantities of marijuana is a waste of our resources, first and foremost. We have about 95 pending murders in Wake County right now, and yet our current Wake County District Attorney is prosecuting adult use quantities of marijuana without any pause. And so I think now is a perfect time to change that, and we can make real progress.
Just so those here know, and maybe those that don't, what would qualify as adult use quantities?
Sure, up to 1.5 ounces.
Okay, okay. And I guess, is that like the separation between like felony and misdemeanor? I guess where's the line?
So the separation for just possession is up to 1.5 ounces. Up to 1/2 ounce is a Class 3 misdemeanor in North Carolina. Up to 1.5 ounces is a Class 1 misdemeanor in North Carolina. There are other gradations. So for instance, if I were to possess marijuana, 1 ounce of marijuana, and have it divided up into baggies, I might be accused of possession with intent to sell and deliver, which is a felony. So there are ways that you can be prosecuted for having less than 1/2 ounce, but divided up or along with equipment that suggests you're actually selling. In my view, up to 1.5 ounces doesn't need to be prosecuted in terms of the possession of it. But we need to look very critically about whether people are actually selling it and what that really means when they have it divided up in baggies. So it would be a broader vision about how we can address the issue of marijuana in Wake County.
Yeah. Now, whenever I think about the individuals that use cannabis, I mean, it's a broad spectrum. It covers all races, all creeds, all age groups. Criminalization, from my perspective, it hasn't curbed use, right? Like the idea of, like, I don't think the threat of incarceration is as effective. Do you find that to be the case? Like, do you find that people will use it anyway?
Well, I don't know. I mean,
I guess more so the individuals that you
yeah.
interact with.
Well, let me say one thing about marijuana. Is it typically, for most marijuana cases, you're not going to prison for that. That is fairly rare, and you have to have quite a lot of it to go to prison. And certainly for anything up to 1.5 ounces, you're almost certainly not going to jail or prison. You might go to jail for a brief time, but you're not going to prison, generally speaking. So, and I forgot your
it's okay.
question.
Yeah, I was just saying, do you find the threat of incarceration to be an effective means of curbing use, of making it less popular?
I'd like to think of it a little bit differently, because the threat of incarceration will curb some use of anything. I mean, we could threaten to incarcerate people to drink coffee, and I probably would drink less coffee. Maybe not no coffee, but I would drink less coffee. So the threat of incarceration will affect any of that. Whether that's a useful tool in our bag of things to apply, that's the problem. That's the issue.
No, that's fair. And coffee is technically a drug.
Yes, it is a drug. It is a drug.
Do you think ending the prosecution of low-level cannabis offenses will help the judicial system to function better?
Yes. So, and we can talk a little bit about the problems that the state now has with prosecuting marijuana in North Carolina. But the state legislature has essentially legalized hemp. And there are going to be folks in this room that are going to be more familiar with the intricacies of hemp laws, because frankly, the fact that hemp is hemp doesn't really concern me at this stage, because I am a criminal defense attorney and really focus on the crimes that people potentially are liable for. But the issue in North Carolina is that in trying to prove that somebody has marijuana, which is a crime in North Carolina, to try to prove that, you can't simply look at the drug any longer. You can't look at the leaves any longer. You can't look at the marijuana and say it's marijuana. That used to be the case. There was case law, and when I started practicing law, and there are other probably defense attorneys in the room here who remember this, you would just walk into court and the police officer would be able to testify it smelled like marijuana, it looked like marijuana, and therefore it was deemed to be marijuana, and the jury or the judge could accept that as marijuana. That's no longer the case because marijuana now, the definition of marijuana, because hemp was illegal and so marijuana was illegal as well, the issue in North Carolina is it's the THC concentration. In order to understand what the THC concentration is, you have to run it through a special machine, gas chromatograph mass spectrometer to find out what the THC levels are. That's expensive. And we have a local crime lab in Wake County called the City County Bureau of Identification. We have a state crime lab, and both are underfunded and both need more resources. But one of the most difficult things for them to do in terms of the amount of cases they've got is to test marijuana, because they've got other cases. They've got murders, they've got rapes, they've got robberies, they've got fingerprints, they've got DNA analysis to do, and to take analysts away from those important things to focus on marijuana is problematic.
Do you find that that would be a similar hang-up with the increasing popularity of like Delta 8, Delta 9, Delta 20, the like various CBD derivatives that under the hemp bill are legal, or under the Farm Act are legal, and that still contain psychoactive properties and that people can buy legally because it would potentially test as THC?
If it would, and I'm not as familiar with those substances, so if it would test when a mass spectrometer gas chromatograph, if it would test, sorry, not on, by eyeball, it would test as Delta 8, or as actual marijuana when it's in fact Delta 8, which I assume is legal, then you have a problem proving that in court. Because at the end of the day, what comes in and proves whether someone's guilty in a trial is what happens within the four corners of the trial. And so whatever we might assume it is based on our assumptions, we don't bring those into a court typically and say, okay, well, we assume it's marijuana because it looked a certain way. They've got to prove it in court. And the more effort that needs to go into proving something in court just makes it harder for the state to prove. Some things are very important to prove. I mean, when somebody is killed, it's very important to prove those things and assure that you have the right person when you're prosecuting that person and putting that person in prison for murder. Marijuana is on the different end of the spectrum, and as it becomes more increasingly expensive and cumbersome to test those things, then it becomes difficult for the state to prove. And then it impacts that issue of court resources that we're talking about. Because right now in Wake County, in the Justice Center, in the last couple of months, and my opponent sometimes says, well, we aren't doing that very much, but I've been in trials where they have done it, where my clients have been, they've tried to prosecute my clients in misdemeanor court by simply saying, well, it looked like marijuana. And that doesn't fly any longer, and these folks are all being found, or mostly being found not guilty, assuming they have a good judge. They're being found not guilty, and so that's an hour or two of time out of court that is being taken away from resolving some other case. And that other case is not just some random case. That other case is often a domestic violence case or an assault case, and a case where there was a real victim who really needs their day in court and who keeps coming back to court hoping that the defendant that hit them or assaulted them is going to be tried that day, but they're not because we're trying the marijuana case.
Why do cannabis, like, I guess you have the option to plea versus the option to go to court? Is that, am I understanding that properly? If someone were to get arrested, like, is it super common for it to end up in trial court? People to get arrested for cannabis possession?
If they hire, and I saw some friends of mine that are other attorneys, but if they hire one of the good attorneys in Wake County, one of the thoughtful attorneys, and most of them are good, they're going to go to trial. You plead guilty to things where the state can prove it and they're offering something to you in exchange for the plea. We could give you 3 days of jail, or we could give you a year of probation. Which would you like? And you're going to get one of those things, and you decide, well, I'd like the year of probation because I don't want to go to jail for a couple of days. That's why you would plead guilty. There's no, in my view, and obviously I've been a defense attorney for 12 years, in my view, you should not simply walk into court and plead guilty to things unless the state can prove those things. That's the way the system works. That's how our founders created the system. That's what we're sworn to uphold, both as district attorneys and as defense attorneys. So I would never advise anyone to go in and simply plead guilty to a crime without establishing first that the state could prove the case. Now, there are deferral programs in Wake County. And a deferral program is where you agree to do certain things, and in exchange for doing those certain things, for instance, drug treatment and paying court costs and fines and staying out of trouble, the case would ultimately be dismissed. The problem in Wake County is that those programs are expensive. So they run about $450 right now total. And they are, and for those of us, I'm fortunate enough to have a good job and so forth. For someone like me, I can afford the $450 if I'm in trouble like that. But for people that are living on the edge, that are trying to make ends meet, that's especially in Wake County. Everyone knows what the housing costs are like now. It is extremely expensive. And what happens is it's a cascading effect. If you fail out of that program, then you get a conviction, then you might lose your public housing or your leased housing, where the landlord says, well, we don't want you here anymore because you got a marijuana conviction. Now you're out of your housing, and it's a whole cascade of problems, or you lose your job. So that went on for a little while.
It's okay.
But I'm passionate about this stuff. But that's why you shouldn't plead guilty. That's why you should take your case to trial, and that's the issue that ultimately we're presented with in Wake County, with a DA's office that has decided we're not going to dismiss these cases.
Are there any like common patterns for how individuals usually get caught with cannabis?
How they usually get caught depends in part upon their socioeconomic and racial background, and that's partly because in the United States, race is often coded in socioeconomic background, unfortunately, given our history. And so younger people who are people of color, are more often caught in cars or out on the street or on the park bench or something like that. And that could be younger people, could be people of color, could be some combination. And that's, of course, not uniform, right? I mean, that is not that everybody who's caught, or that only people of color are caught in that way, but that's what the statistics show.
Is that a pattern that you notice as a defense
That's
attorney?
what I notice as a defense attorney, yes. And so a typical scenario will be that a person's driving along in a particular part of town, which is known to be a part of town which is not a good part of town, and they might be pulled over for a window tint violation or for a minor traffic violation. So where we all make minor traffic violations. Whenever you're out driving, I don't care whether you're being the most careful person in the world, you're making a traffic violation at some point. And at some point you can be pulled over by an officer typically for a legitimate reason. And the Supreme Court has said that that's a legitimate reason to pull over a car. The officer can have a surreptitious reason for pulling you over and can decide to pull you over because you change a lane the wrong way or don't use your blinker. You get pulled over, the officer walks up, and the officer then smells the odor of marijuana, either burnt or fresh. And that, the law is in flux, but that can be a reason to search the car. And that leads to a cascade of other issues. So.
No, I appreciate that insight.
And arrests. So that's
Right.
how people get arrested for the marijuana individually in themselves.
More common than others. I
Yes.
wondered about that. Okay. Let's say you're arrested for cannabis possession. Well, not you. Let's say someone is arrested for cannabis possession and is convicted. We've kind of talked about that a little bit, but could you expand a little bit on how their life could inevitably impact? I mean, you talked a lot about housing. Are there other issues that could arise based on that conviction? Other ways it could damage someone's life.
Reputation, although but housing, housing and job are the two major ways in which we can survive in this society. So, and then there could be the cascading effect as a result of that. There are also, of course, I don't know how many times folks have been in criminal courtrooms, but they are extremely stressful. I mean, they were very stressful for me when I was a young attorney going in there, but there's a real mental health component to that, and I know we talk a lot about mental health, but there is an enormous amount of stress that comes out of coming to court every couple of months. That puts stress and strains on relationships and all the cascading effects of that. So, you know, I don't want to minimize anything, but I think that the fact that, you know, that affects your employment or can affect your employment, and I'm thinking of a client right now who's facing a marijuana charge, and you know, he's got a good job, and he's got a CDL, commercial driver's license, and so, and that's a good thing. It's a way for somebody to move up and earn a good living, and you know, he's facing a conviction that, you know, would be devastating for him, you know, and it's tragic because at the end of the day, we've decided as a society with marijuana that we're not going to prosecute it very heavily. We're going to just prosecute it enough to, well, I mean, compared to the other crimes that I handle, we're going to prosecute it heavily enough to cause very serious consequences to you. But then as a human being, you then have to live in the society. You have to have a job. You have to be a productive part of the community. And when you have that stigma of having had that conviction, and that creates difficulty for you getting a job, and for you getting housing and colors the way people think about you, it's problematic.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to think about like the state by state regulation setup, right? Is that, well, like I bought these just because they're good. I buy these at Food Lion. I buy these copies of like Women in Weed and Medical Marijuana magazines at Food Lion, at Harris Teeter. In a number of states, we've accepted the fact that, like, objectively, it should be regulated, it should be safe, it should be, you know, accessible, but like in a safe and kind of controlled format. But simultaneously, you live in states where you have this, and it could detrimentally impact your life. So,
well, John Boehner, who used to be the Speaker of the House, is now a lobbyist for marijuana growers. So, I mean, you know, certain parts of the society can do great at it, the lobbyists and the lawyers, but you know, other folks get hammered with it, and it's just really, really, a simple word for it is bad. It's bad for our society.
Yeah.
That's not to say, I want to be clear, it's not to say that I necessarily endorse marijuana smoking per se. I mean, I'm not here as an advocate for marijuana smoking. But I'm here for building a society that, you know, thinks about how we can handle these problems without just using the tool of the carceral state.
No, it's okay. Well, and honestly, I mean, like I said, kind of at the beginning, because, like I said, we invited both sitting DA Freeman as well as you to this conversation, and for a lot of people, it's tough. Not gonna lie though, I can tell that you're probably not a marijuana user because you use the term marijuana. Does anyone in here use cannabis? Use the term cannabis and pretty much never says the word marijuana? Yeah, that's very more common.
Okay,
people in the space, but it's okay. It's okay.
I'm also a Gen Xer, so I'm like old now. So.
I think honestly, I think it speaks to your openness about the topic. They're open to discuss it. Because
we have to call it
terminology
cannabis
kind
now.
of
Is that the,
that's what some of us say, but not everybody.
All right, I'll say cannabis.
So I actually did have a question about this. This is something that I am not in tune to at all, and I was very curious about. Mandatory minimum sentencing is exceptionally harsh in a number of states. Can you talk to us just a little bit more about what mandatory minimums look like for cannabis in North Carolina?
Yes. So it starts at 10 pounds. 10 pounds of marijuana gets you to 25 months. So, and I'm not going to have all the gradations there, but it's 10 pounds, and then I think the next, so 10 to 49 pounds, and then 50 pounds and up, and then like it's some massive amount on the high end. I've never had any, well, I did in a federal court. I did in the federal court. I had a guy with like 1,000 pounds or something like that. But in terms of state court, typically the most you're going to get is a 10 pound or above in terms of the arrest. There might be others out there. And so let me explain, what is a mandatory minimum? A mandatory minimum, I mean, it's sort of a term of art because when you think about it, murder has a mandatory minimum. If you kill somebody in first degree murder, there's a mandatory minimum in North Carolina. It's life in prison for first degree murder. But what we're talking about really is in drug crimes where there is the attachment of certain mandatory prison sentences that you must serve, because of the weight of drug that you had, the amount of drug you had. Marijuana is 10 pounds. So it's different for other drugs, and it's a little bit more problematic. And I see one of my former colleagues, Morgan, over there. So. But it's different for other drugs. But to be clear, I am not for the non-prosecution of marijuana trafficking. That is to say, I will, as the district attorney of Wake County, prosecute marijuana trafficking. The reason for that is that when we have a society like this, where we are beginning the process of moving toward a more sane drug policy, and I think moving to a less carceral state-driven drug policy is the appropriate thing to do across the board, we cannot have a situation in which Wake County is an outlier, and the district attorney essentially says, well, we're not prosecuting large-scale drug trafficking through Wake County. That would be catastrophic. It would be unhelpful to the solutions that I think most of us want to achieve, and it would be detrimental to the public safety of Wake County. So I am not for the non-prosecution of 10 pounds or more of marijuana. That doesn't, and I understand that can be a problematic issue. I'm happy to have that conversation if there's a question and answer, but one of the things that doesn't happen is that no one wakes up tomorrow with 10 pounds of marijuana in their car and figures, where did I get the 10 pounds of marijuana? They were in the business. And so there's a qualitative and quantitative difference. That is a little bit different from opiates in North Carolina, where 4 grams, which is basically like three paper clips, can get you, and I'm going to forget the minimums, like 70 months in prison for an opiate. And so that's my position on marijuana. Or marijuana trafficking.
Are repeat offenses really common for possession?
Of
Small
marijuana?
scale, like adult use, yes.
I don't know what the statistics are. I'm going to say I would probably assume that people do smoke cannabis repeatedly, so they offend repeatedly.
Got it. I was curious about, so usage rates, I think we talked about this, are essentially the same across like all demographics. Like in terms of like race and everything, like white cannabis users just as common as black or people of color using cannabis. But you know, obviously the arrest rate is different. In some states, it's as low as like 3 to 1 people of color being arrested versus like 3 to 1 being white. And in some states, it's as high as like 8 or 10 to 1. In your experience of just kind of like walking into the courthouse and working there day to day, do you find that to be reflective of the Wake County system?
I don't know, and I don't want to speak out of turn about that. I mean, if you walk into the Wake County Justice Center, you will be struck by the number of people of color that fill up the lines and fill up the pews and fill up the courtrooms. I don't know what they're all there for, and so I don't want to speak out of turn about that, about the statistics.
But it's probably a little bit jarring though to walk in and kind
It
of see the racial
but
disparity.
that accounts for. I've talked about this in other contexts. And I know this is about cannabis, but there's racial injustice that is a part of the criminal justice system, and that is reflected in other parts of the system.
Absolutely. So a number of DAs across the country have shifted to this like decline to prosecute for minor cannabis offenses. However, I have read about some instances in which law enforcement will push back. Mm-hmm. How, like, what would be the practice? What would be the best practice in this instance, or how do you mitigate that kind of like reverb on the back end if you were to be elected or that were to happen?
Conversations work. I think they can work with a lot of the police departments. I don't think that fortunately we have had a history of the DA's office having had an antagonistic relationship with the police departments, nor do I have one. I mean, I'm a defense attorney, but I get along just great with police officers who do their job well. And so I have no particular issue or ideological problem with policing. We live in a society where we need policing, and we need good police. I would encourage them to understand what the charging policy is or the prosecution policy is of the DA's office. Now, in other jurisdictions, and I've seen this on television, the prosecutor makes the charging decision ultimately. But in Wake County, or North Carolina, generally speaking, for most crimes, the police just charge without necessarily consulting the DA's office about what the appropriate charge is. And then ultimately, the DA's office can modify those charges. And for marijuana cases, including marijuana trafficking cases, those are cases that are almost always going to be charged basically by the police officers. If they continue to charge adult use quantities of marijuana, those cases will continue to be dismissed, and that will not be a good use of their time.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time out to speak with us today. Elections May 17th?
May 17th.
May 17th. So thank you. As a Wake County citizen, this was just such an incredible conversation, so I really appreciate you taking the time today. Do we want to open the floor up to Q&A?
That would be great.
Okay. Does anyone have any questions, anything they'd like to speak on or ask about? To be honest, I feel like this is probably a very one-sided audience, if you can imagine.
Well, you can push me on some of the things that I'm not willing to do. So.
I have a question.
Sure.
I remember, I think the conversation we were having a second ago about the pushback with the police department and the DA's office led me to remember about when hemp was legalized. And there was a pushback, a very vehement pushback from the police department and law enforcement against smokable hemp being legalized because they couldn't tell the difference between any type of cannabis with smell and everything else. And if my memory serves me correctly, our current DA was very supportive of making sure that smokable hemp did not become legal for that purpose. And they succeeded in that for a short period of time. Would you have handled that differently? And if so, how?
Yes. So what we're talking about there is we're talking about at the policy level, not at the charging level. Is that what we're? Yeah. And we're talking about the decision made about whether to legalize smokable hemp. Just so we're repeating that for everyone to hear. And the issue goes back to this. If you think back to how these cases were originally charged and proved, that was by an officer coming into court and saying, I smelled the marijuana, I looked at the marijuana, it was a green leafy substance, therefore it was marijuana. And so the odor was built into North Carolina's case law about how an officer could establish a drug, the drug of marijuana. That is unlike any other drug that I'm aware of, because you can't just look at what is a white powder and say, that looks like cocaine to me, that's cocaine. You have to get it tested. And you can't do that with any other drug, heroin, meth, and so forth. So it was the only kind of drug that the police could go into a courtroom and essentially be qualified as an expert and say, this is marijuana. When smokable hemp became legal, and the reason why our elected DA, well, I don't want to speak for her, but I assume the reason why was because she is concerned about the fact that we have a situation now where the DAs, the prosecutors, have difficulty establishing in a courtroom that the quote-unquote marijuana they found in the car was in fact marijuana, because it is essentially indistinguishable by odor or by appearance from marijuana. And so they have to run it through the gas spectrometer, mass spectrometer, gas chromatograph to test the THC levels. So I would have handled that differently. I frankly, while I want to be careful here, I am not endorsing. My personal view on marijuana is a little bit more complicated than simply, I think people who overconsume marijuana, as if they overconsume anything, that is a problem, that is an issue. But there are solutions out, just because I believe that's an issue and a problem and a concern and a health concern for our community does not mean I think it should be shoved through the criminal justice system, because what we've ended up doing in society is pushing these cases through the criminal justice system. To your issue, if you want to prosecute these cases, you would have my view is that marijuana should be generally legal. I have a different view than her. And so that's how I would have approached that issue. The fact of the matter is we've known for 10, 15 years that marijuana in the United States is moving towards some sort of decriminalization or legality. And this issue about how to prosecute certain crimes that you still want to prosecute has to be resolved. When our country was originally founded, the founders said essentially you're not going to have general warrants. You're not going to be able to just generally search homes. You're going to have a reason for that, to search a home. You're going to have to give a particularized description of what you expect to find in the home and why you think that the criminal activity should be in the home or would be found in the home. Marijuana in the last 50 years became a general warrant. It essentially became a method by which police could say, I smell marijuana, I'm going into the home. And so it became a very convenient way for police to be able to enter homes and search for whatever else they wanted to search for. Maybe they found something, maybe they didn't. If they didn't find anything, then the person whose home was searched felt violated, but nothing really happened because they didn't have anything really to complain about, no harm, no foul. And if they found something, then it became, oh, I did find the marijuana that I did smell. So the government, and this is where I am still in some sense a libertarian, the government believing that it can search any home, that is a powerful thing for the government to have. And that is a concerning thing for anybody, regardless of your political spectrum. I am no longer a libertarian, but that is a problem. When North Carolina made smokable hemp legal, it essentially has eviscerated that reason to search. And we're going to have to find a new solution. We're going to have to be better police officers and better law enforcement officers in Wake County to justify our searches and not just rely on the old claim that, oh, I smelled marijuana. A very long-winded answer, but I would have handled that issue differently.
Yeah.
So first of all, I like a long-winded answer, but you mentioned some other topics and conversations that you want to have, and since a lot of them are connected, I'm curious to hear what those are, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I feel like I've heard you touch on them, but I'm curious about women's issues, and especially the past 2 years, we've had a socioeconomic awakening, and I'm curious to hear how you feel like the new normal can be addressed, like through the government. Sure.
Well, let me focus specifically on the role I'm running for, and I can chat with you maybe afterwards about some of those other issues, but I am for the ending of the death penalty in Wake County. So we have a district attorney who sought the death penalty more frequently than any other DA in North Carolina in the last 6 years. I'm for ending that, no longer seeking that. It's extremely costly, and there are incredible racial biases built into that process, as witnessed by her prosecution in 2019 of John Sander, a white man that I and 2 other attorneys represented, who was given the life sentence, and Siaga Gillard, a man from the Caribbean, but a black man who was given the death penalty. Now, they were both horrific crimes. I'm not minimizing the crimes at all. The crimes were horrific. John Sander will spend the rest of his life in prison. Siaga Gillard probably will, because we don't impose the death penalty any longer in North Carolina, really. We haven't done an execution in 15 or 16 years. But the seeking of the death penalty, I think, is improper, is wrong. So that's 2. 3 is I'm going to end the pay-for-play system in Wake County, which hurts mostly people in the margins and poor folks. And that is where we charge high fees and fines as part of the court process. And I talked a little bit about that, about the deferral program. 4th is that I'm going to take the resources that we're, in my view, wasting on some of these misapplications and marijuana, adult use quantities of marijuana, for instance, and move them over and prosecute the 95 murders that are pending, the violent crimes that need to be handled, because everyone deserves to be safe. And then the last part of that platform that I'm running on is to make Wake County's DA's office look like Wake County. At its top level, it's all white, and it's been like that since the beginning of her tenure and before that. But that needs to change because you don't get a diversity of perspectives about how things affect different parts of the community. I have other thoughts about, you know, the socioeconomic problems. I think these things are much, much deeper than a criminal justice system. And there is incredible inequality in our country. And it's very, we are very privileged in Wake County, most of us are very privileged in Wake County. But, you know, I travel throughout Eastern North Carolina. And it's heartbreaking, you know. And the issue is this infects the way the society kind of operates. And we put a lot of pressure on progressive. I'm running as a progressive DA, obviously, and there's going to be a lot of emphasis if I win on what I can do. But the real fact of the matter is that we need a reordering of the way in which our society treats people, and that's a much longer conversation.
Yes.
So I was wondering if you think that, you know, from, I guess, the law enforcement and prosecution perspective, do you think it would be good to have like a sheriff, for example, that is, you know, open to the legalization of marijuana, kind of touching on what I guess your friend said, that when they were trying to combat that law, they had the sheriffs, they had everybody up there grandstanding and trying to end it. So don't you think it would be important to have a sheriff that would be open to that, receptive to that, and also going back to the social economic circumstances where people get pulled over typically in poor areas because they can't afford to fix up their car, and they're usually stopped for these offenses. Well, don't you think it would be important to have law enforcement, or even a sheriff in particular, to have a policy of where when you go to search a car, you actually have to make them sign a consent form. That way it kind of makes them think, hey, should I let this person search my car? That would reduce a lot of, you know, the issues, but do you think that would be a good idea to, especially working with that person, to be able to do that?
So I would love to have a sheriff that would, or any law enforcement officer. We have about 13 law enforcement agencies in Wake County. So Cary, Raleigh, Rollsville, you know, all the police departments, and then the sheriff's department. I would love to have a sheriff or any law enforcement agency join me in understanding that we need to move to a more sane marijuana policy. I think as a practical matter, I think those consent forms to search a car, let me tell you as a defense attorney, when I see them, that ends the question about whether there was consent to search the car. You know, so I mean, I think they're really smart policies. That would be up to the police departments about how they want to handle that. But I would encourage them to adopt smart policies, because as a defense attorney, when I see that, there's no question, generally there's no question about whether that person consented. Because sometimes a client will tell you, wow, I didn't consent. Either they forgot or they're not being terribly truthful with you. So I would encourage that sort of stuff. Just like, I mean, there's a lot of concern among law enforcement about body cams when they were first being thought about. And in fact, they're very valuable for almost always for law enforcement. I mean, they establish, not definitively, but they generally establish what generally happened. And so those have been great tools for law enforcement as well. So.
Any other questions? Going once? Just kidding. Thank you so much for sitting down with us today. Really appreciate it. Give him a hand. We're coming up here.